In the summer of 1969, a 23-year-old Army nurse named Linda Van Devanter arrived at the 71st Evacuation Hospital at Pleiku, South Vietnam. She had volunteered. She had wanted to serve. She had grown up believing in her country the way her parents had taught her to, completely and without reservation. What she found at Pleiku was a receiving ward where helicopters deposited young men in pieces, where the work was triage and surgery and amputation and the management of wounds that no textbook had fully prepared her for, and where the only thing that kept you functional was the absolute necessity of staying functional because the next helicopter was already inbound. Van Devanter spent a year at Pleiku. She came home in 1970 to an airport where a man spit on her uniform. She spent the next decade trying to convince the Veterans Administration that she existed. She was not alone. Approximately 11,000 American women served in Vietnam. The vast majority were nurses, assigned to evacuation hospitals, surgical units, and the hospital ships that operated offshore. A smaller number served in administrative, intelligence, and communications roles. 8 American military women died in Vietnam, all nurses. Their names are on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. For decades after the war, they were largely invisible in the public memory of what Vietnam had been, absent from the films, the memoirs, the political debates, the VA waiting rooms, the men who had served beside them, the generals who had depended on them, the government that had sent them. All of them, in their different ways, proceeded as if the women had not been there. The nursing assignments that brought women to Vietnam were not administrative accidents. The Army Nurse Corps had been a functioning military organization since 1901. By 1965, as American troop levels in Vietnam began their rapid escalation, the demand for skilled surgical nurses in forward areas was immediate and pressing. The wounds produced by the Vietnam War's weapons, high-velocity rifle rounds, fragmentation grenades, mine blasts, napalm, were catastrophic in ways that required skilled surgical intervention close to the point of injury. The military's decision to establish a network of evacuation hospitals within helicopter range of combat operations meant that wounded men could reach surgical care within the golden hour, the 60-minute window in which aggressive treatment produced dramatically better survival rates. The nurses who staffed those hospitals were not support personnel in any meaningful sense. They were essential medical professionals working under conditions that no civilian hospital had prepared them for. Lieutenant Sharon Lane arrived at the 312th Evacuation Hospital at Chu Lai in April 1969. She was 25 years old, from Canton, Ohio, a graduate of Altman Hospital School of Nursing, who had joined the Army in 1968. Lane worked in the Vietnamese ward, treating South Vietnamese civilians and soldiers alongside American casualties. On June 8, 1969, a North Vietnamese rocket attack struck the hospital compound. Lane was killed at her duty station. She was the only American servicewoman killed by direct enemy fire in Vietnam. She was promoted posthumously to captain. A statue of her stands today at Altman Hospital in Canton. A street near the hospital is named for her. Most Americans have never heard her name. The work inside the evacuation hospitals was documented in clinical records and personal diaries that nurses kept against regulations, because the regulations against keeping personal records were less important than the need to process what they were seeing. The clinical records show the case statistics. The diaries show everything else. Nurse Diane Carlson Evans, who served at the 36th Evacuation Hospital at Vung Tau and later at the 71st at Pleiku, kept a diary that described the specific arithmetic of her days. She might receive 200 casualties in a single day following a major engagement. She describes performing tasks that required 3 people and doing them alone because there were not 3 people. She describes holding a soldier's hand while he died because he had asked her not to leave him and she had promised. She describes walking out of the hospital at the end of a shift and sitting on the ground outside and being unable to stand up again for a period she could not estimate because time had stopped functioning normally. The psychological literature on combat trauma in the Vietnam era was focused almost entirely on male combatants. The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was not formalized until 1980, and even then the research base that informed it was drawn overwhelmingly from male veterans. Women who came home from Vietnam with nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and the inability to form or maintain relationships were not recognized by the VA system as having service-connected psychological conditions. They were women. The assumption, never stated but operationally present in every interaction with the bureaucracy, was that whatever was wrong with them was not connected to what they had done in Vietnam, because what they had done in Vietnam was nursing, which was what women did, and nursing was not combat, even when the rockets were landing on the hospital. The VA's treatment of female Vietnam veterans was a systemic failure that took decades to partially correct. To receive care through the VA, a veteran had to demonstrate service-connected conditions. For a nurse who had spent a year managing blast casualties and had come home with PTSD, demonstrating the service connection required navigating a bureaucracy that had not been designed with her in mind, that frequently did not have female staff to conduct examinations, and that operated on an implicit baseline assumption that the most significant psychological impacts of military service were produced by direct combat exposure. Women had not been in direct combat. The rocket that killed Sharon Lane had not been informed of this distinction, but the bureaucracy maintained it regardless. Linda Van Devanter's experience when she sought VA care after returning home in 1970 was not unusual. She was told at various points that her symptoms were not service-connected, that she was experiencing hormonal issues, that she should see a civilian psychiatrist. She had treated men whose faces had been destroyed by fragmentation. She had held pressure on wounds while aircraft landed. She had worked 20-hour shifts for weeks. The VA offered her a referral. She eventually became an advocate for female Vietnam veterans and wrote a memoir, Home Before Morning, published in 1983, that was the first major public account of what women nurses had experienced in Vietnam. The book received significant attention and contributed to a slow shift in how the VA approached female veterans' claims. Slow is the operative word. The Vietnam Women's Memorial was dedicated in Washington in 1993, 10 years after the Vietnam Veterans Memorial itself. The dedication was attended by thousands of women veterans who had waited a decade for formal public acknowledgement of their service. Diane Carlson Evans had spent years organizing the campaign to build the memorial, navigating the political and bureaucratic resistance of a veterans establishment that was not certain the monument was necessary. Some male veterans organizations opposed it. Some members of Congress questioned whether it was warranted. Evans persisted through a decade of opposition that required more sustained effort than most people understood at the time. The memorial, designed by sculptor Glenna Goodacre, depicts 3 women, 2 nurses tending a wounded soldier, a third looking skyward. It stands near the wall, in the grove of trees that lines the mall, close enough to the names of the dead that the spatial relationship is legible. The wounded soldier is a man. The women tending him are the context for his wound. Some critics of the memorial's design argued that this framing replicated the very subordination it was meant to counter, that women who had served as subjects rather than supports deserved a different representation. This argument was made after the dedication. The memorial stands as it was designed. The 8 women whose names are on the wall, Sharon Lane, Eleanor Alexander, Hedwig Orlowski, Pamela Donovan, Carol Drasba, Annie Graham, Elizabeth Jones, Mary Clinker, died in different circumstances. Lane by enemy rocket, Mary Clinker in the C-5A Galaxy crash during Operation Babylift in April 1975. The others in aircraft accidents and other non-combat incidents over the course of the war. They are listed chronologically among the 58,279, their names no larger and no smaller than the names around them. They are equal in death to the men they had treated, in the way the wall equalizes everyone it names. The women who served in Vietnam and came home alive number approximately 11,000, most of them now in their 70s and 80s. A VA study conducted in the 1990s found that female Vietnam veterans had significantly elevated rates of PTSD, depression, and substance abuse compared to women of the same age who had not served. The study found that the delay in recognizing and treating these conditions had compounded their severity. It found that women who had sought VA care in the years immediately following the war had frequently been turned away or misdiagnosed. The study recommended expanded outreach and dedicated treatment programs. Implementation was, as it tends to be with VA reforms, gradual. Diane Carlson Evans is in her 70s now. She speaks at veterans events and schools when she is asked. She describes the work she did at Vung Tau and Pleiku in the same flat, factual tone that nurses use when they are describing clinical events, and then occasionally something breaks through the clinical language and you understand that the flatness is not detachment, but the specific kind of control that people develop when they have been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Linda van Devanter died in 2002 at the age of 55. The cause was a systemic illness that she believed, and that her physicians suspected but died of a connective tissue disorder. She was 55 years old. Her death received a brief notice in the veterans' press. The major obituary pages did not cover it extensively. The woman who had written the first major account of what American women had endured in Vietnam, who had spent years fighting for recognition that the VA had initially refused to provide, died without the kind of public acknowledgement that the scope of her contribution warranted. The 11,000 women who served in Vietnam did not ask for a separate memorial. They did not ask for special recognition beyond what any veteran was entitled to. What they asked for, and what took 20 or more years to receive in partial and incomplete form, was simply to be counted, to be included in the category of people who had been there. To have the VA acknowledge that a year of triage surgery in a rocket-targeted hospital in Pleiku produced the same psychological damage as a year in a rifle company in the same province, because the helicopters that brought the casualties to Linda van Devanter's ward had been flying over the same ground.